They laughed at him before the sun went down. By morning, not a single man in that town would dare remember the sound of it. The dust hung low over Red Hollow, drifting through the open saloon doors like it had nowhere better to be, catching the late light in thin golden streaks that cut across boots, cards, and half-empty glasses. And right there in the middle of it all sat Elias Crow, still as a fence post in winter, shoulders squared, hat low, saying nothing while the noise circled him like flies that didn't know when to leave a quiet thing alone. "You deaf or just dumb?" someone called from the far table, a voice thick with cheap whiskey and the kind of courage that only shows up in groups. And the others followed quick, laughter bouncing off the wooden walls, sharp and careless, as if the silence in front of them was an invitation instead of a warning. Elias didn't look up, didn't shift. His hands rested on the table, worn knuckles catching the light, steady as stone, and that steadiness only seemed to bother them more. "Man's got no tongue," another said, louder this time, leaning forward like he expected a reaction he could grab hold of, twist into something useful, something entertaining. But all he got back was nothing, and nothing, out here, had a way of making men uneasy when they didn't understand it. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stood near the bar, watching with that slow half-smile of his, the kind that never reached his eyes, fingers hooked into his belt like he owned the air in the room, and maybe in Red Hollow, he did. "Every man's got something to say," Briggs muttered, not loud, not soft, just enough to tilt the room in his direction, and the laughter leaned with him, shifting shape, turning from mockery into something tighter, something that wanted proof. A glass slid across the table, stopping just short of Elias's hand, amber liquid trembling at the rim. "Drink," the man said. "Or speak. One of the two." Elias's gaze stayed lowered, but there was the smallest pause, the kind you'd miss if you blinked, and for a second, the room held its breath without knowing why. Then someone chuckled, breaking it. "See? Nothing there." The word nothing landed heavier than it should have. Outside, a board creaked in the wind. "Hey!" Horse shifted, hooves grinding softly against packed dirt. Elias reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, every movement measured like it mattered, and for the first time, a few heads leaned in, curiosity edging out the laughter, because a silent man reaching for something is a different kind of story. He didn't pull a weapon, didn't pull money. What he set on the table was small. A worn leather band, darkened with age, marked with a pattern most of the room had never seen, and he placed it there like it belonged, like it carried weight the rest of them couldn't feel yet. "That your voice?" someone joked, but the humor was thinner now, stretched too far. Briggs stepped closer, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "You passing through, Crow?" he said, not a question, more like a claim. Elias didn't answer, didn't need to. The sheriff studied the band, then the man, then back again, and whatever thought crossed his mind didn't stay long enough to matter, because he let out a short breath and waved it off. "Doesn't change a thing," he added, louder now, letting the room hear it, letting the mood reset. "Man who won't speak don't get much respect around here." A few nods, a few smirks returning, relieved to have the ground steady again. Someone tipped the glass just enough for a line of whiskey to spill, dripping off the edge of the table and darkening the dust near Elias's boot. "Accident," the man said, not meaning it. Elias looked at the spill. Then, finally, he lifted his eyes, not to the man, not to the sheriff, but to the far wall where a faded marking had been scratched into the wood long before any of them had claimed this place as theirs, a shape simple and old, half worn by time, half hidden by shadow. And for the briefest moment, something moved behind his stillness, something remembered, something measured, and then it was gone again, buried deep where no one here could reach it. He picked up the leather band, closed his hand around it, and stood. The chair legs scraped once against the floor, loud in a room that had suddenly forgotten how to fill its own silence. And without a word, without a glance back, Elias Crow walked toward the door, the light catching his outline as he stepped into the dust and the fading day, leaving behind laughter that tried to follow but didn't quite make it out, like it knew. Even then, it had already gone too far. The door had barely stopped swinging when the sound inside the saloon changed, not louder, not quieter, just different, like something invisible had shifted its weight, and everyone felt it without knowing why. And for a few seconds no one spoke. Glasses held midair, cards forgotten in half-played hands, until one man let out a short laugh that came too late to feel natural, and the others followed. Quicker this time, sharper, as if they needed to prove to themselves that nothing had changed at all. Man walks like he owns the dust, someone muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. But his eyes kept drifting toward the door, like he expected it to open again and correct something left unfinished. Sheriff Dalton Briggs remained where he stood, though his posture had shifted just enough for those watching closely to notice. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his gaze resting not on the men around him, but on the empty space Elias had left behind, measuring it the way a man measures distance before deciding whether it is worth crossing. "It is just a drifter," Briggs said finally, voice steady, almost bored. But there was a slight pause before the words that did not belong there, and a few of the older men caught it, exchanging glances they did not explain. "Seen plenty like him," the sheriff continued, stepping back toward the bar, reclaiming the room with the ease of habit. "Quiet ones, passing through, carrying nothing but dust and trouble they do not even understand." The bartender nodded quickly, grateful for direction, already reaching for another bottle, as if refilling glasses could wash away the strange stillness that had settled in. Outside, the sky stretched wide and pale, the last of the sunlight slipping behind the low hills, leaving the town in that narrow hour where shadows grew longer than the men who cast them. And Elias Crow walked without hurry, boots pressing into the dry ground with the same steady rhythm, neither fast nor slow, as though time had no hold on him at all. He did not look back at the saloon, did not turn his head when a voice called faintly from behind him, something half-hearted, something that tried to sound bold but broke apart in the open air before it could reach him. And he kept moving until the noise of the town softened into distance, replaced by the quieter sounds that most men forgot how to hear. The wind threading through broken fence posts, the distant shift of cattle settling for the night, the soft creak of leather with each step. At the edge of town, near a weathered post where old notices peeled away in curling strips, a figure stood waiting, still as the land itself, wrapped in shadow that did not belong entirely to the fading light. And when Elias approached, he slowed just enough to acknowledge her presence without surprise, as if he had known she would be there long before he stepped outside that door. Nayeli did not speak at first, her eyes steady, dark and sharp, taking in the man before her not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that comes from seeing something you were not expecting but somehow understand all the same. Her gaze dropped briefly to his hand, to the place where the leather band had been, then returned to his face, searching, not for weakness, not for fear, but for something quieter, something deeper, and whatever she found there seemed to settle something inside her that had been unsettled before. The wind shifted between them, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry grass, and for a moment the world felt held in place, balanced on a point too small to see. Elias reached into his coat again, slower this time, and brought out the band, holding it loosely between his fingers, not offering it, not hiding it, simply letting it exist in the space between them. And Nayeli's breath changed, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but real, as her eyes traced the markings worn into the leather, following lines that had meaning far older than this town, far older than the men laughing behind those wooden walls. She stepped closer, one pace, careful, deliberate, as though crossing into something that required respect, and though she did not touch the band, her hand lifted slightly, hovering just short, like she understood that some things are not taken, only recognized. "You should not have stayed," she said at last, her voice low, carrying the weight of something unspoken beneath it, something that did not belong to her alone. And Elias met her gaze without answering, his silence unchanged, but no longer empty, no longer something to be filled by others. Behind them, far back in the town, a door slammed, too loud for the distance, and a dog barked once, then again, sharper, restless, and Nayeli turned her head slightly toward the sound, listening in a way that most people had forgotten how to listen, her expression tightening just enough to reveal that whatever had shifted inside that saloon had not stayed there. "By morning," she said quietly, more to the wind than to him, "they will understand what they have done." Elias did not nod, did not move, but the way his hand closed around the leather band spoke in place of words, and as the last light drained from the sky, The two of them stood at the edge of Red Hollow, the town behind them settling into a night that felt just a little heavier than the one before, as if something had begun that could not be stopped, not by laughter, not by silence, not by men who believed they understood the world simply because they had lived in it long enough to stop questioning it. The night settled over Red Hollow the way dust settles after a long ride, slow at first, then all at once, covering everything in a quiet that felt heavier than it should have. And inside the saloon the lamps burned low, casting long shadows across faces that had begun to lose their earlier confidence, the laughter thinning into something uneven, something forced, like men trying to outrun a feeling they could not name. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stood at the far end of the bar, turning a glass in his hand without drinking from it, watching the reflection of the room shift in the amber light, each movement catching his attention a second too long, as though he was waiting for something to reveal itself in places it did not belong. "You all done staring at ghosts?" he said finally, voice firm, cutting through the low murmur, and a few men straightened, grateful for the direction, nodding more quickly than they needed to. Man walked out. "That is the end of it." The words landed clean, but they did not settle, not fully, not the way they should have, and one of the older ranchers near the back leaned forward slightly. Elbows on the table, eyes narrowed in thought. He did not walk like a man passing through. The rancher said quietly, not challenging, just stating something that had been sitting in his chest since the moment Elias stepped outside, and a few heads turned, not in agreement, but not in dismissal either. Briggs let out a short breath, setting the glass down harder than necessary. "You want to make something out of nothing? You go ahead," he replied, though there was a tightness in his jaw that had not been there before. "I have seen his kind. Quiet does not mean important." No one answered that. Not because they agreed, but because something about the night had begun to press against the edges of their certainty, and even the men who laughed earlier now found themselves glancing toward the door more often than they admitted. Outside, the wind shifted again, colder now, carrying with it a sound too faint to place, something distant, something that might have been nothing at all if it had not come back a second time, slightly clearer, slightly closer, and one of the horses tied along the hitching post lifted its head, ears turning toward the open land beyond the town as if listening to a language the men inside had forgotten. Far from the glow of the saloon, past the last row of buildings where the ground opened into wide stretches of dry grass and low hills, Elias Crow stood beside a small rise, his silhouette blending into the darkness so completely that only the movement of his coat in the wind marked where he was. And beside him Nayeli remained still, her gaze fixed on the horizon, following something that had not yet reached the town but was already present in the air. "They feel it," she said quietly, not looking at him, her voice steady but edged with something that carried both certainty and warning, and Elias did not respond, his attention already turned in the same direction, his posture unchanged but his stillness now sharpened, focused, like a man who knows the difference between silence that is empty and silence that is waiting. The leather band rested in his hand again, the worn markings catching what little light remained, and for a moment he turned it slightly, thumb brushing along the edge as if confirming something that had already been decided. Long before he stepped into that saloon, behind them, the town lights flickered faintly, small against the growing dark, and the distance between where they stood and where the men laughed earlier felt larger now, stretched by something unseen but undeniable. Back inside, one of the younger men pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor in a sharp, uneven sound that made several heads turn. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice lower than before, the bravado from earlier slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. And for a moment no one answered, not because they had not heard anything, but because each man was waiting to see if the others would admit it first. Then it came again, clearer this time, a distant rhythm carried on the wind, steady, measured, not fast, not slow, and though it was still too far to see, too far to name, it was close enough to be felt, a faint vibration beneath the floorboards, beneath the tables, beneath the certainty that had filled the room just hours ago. Sheriff Briggs straightened, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the bar, his eyes narrowing toward the door as the sound reached them again. And this time he did not speak right away, did not dismiss it, because whatever was approaching did not carry the chaos of a threat, did not rush, did not scatter. It moved with a kind of control that made even the strongest men in the room feel, if only for a moment, like they were no longer the ones deciding what came next. Outside, the wind fell still, as if the land itself had chosen to listen, and Elias Crow remained where he stood, unmoving, the leather band held steady in his hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first faint shapes were beginning to form against the night, distant and quiet, but unmistakably real. And beside him Nayeli closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, not in doubt, but in recognition, as though something long expected had finally begun to arrive. The rhythm grew clearer with every passing minute, no longer something imagined or dismissed, but something that settled into the ground itself, steady and deliberate, like a heartbeat that did not belong to the town. And inside the saloon no one laughed anymore, not because they had been told to stop, but because the sound no longer felt like it belonged in the same world as what was approaching. Sheriff Dalton Briggs moved first, not in panic, not in haste, but with the careful control of a man who understood that how he walked in the next few moments would be remembered longer than anything he might say. And he stepped toward the door, pushing it open just enough to let the night air slip inside. Cooler now, carrying that same distant rhythm that had begun to press against every man's thoughts. One by one, the others followed, drawn not by curiosity, but by something closer to obligation, the need to see what their instincts had already begun to warn them about. And they gathered along the front of the saloon, boots settling into the dirt, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the open land beyond the edge of town where the darkness had started to move in a way that did not belong to shadows. At first it was only shapes, faint and uncertain against the horizon, too distant to count, too steady to ignore, and then the sound aligned with what they saw, the rhythm of hooves measured and even, not rushing, not scattered, but organized in a way that spoke of intention rather than chance. "That is not a cattle drive," one man whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them, and no one answered because they all knew it already. The line of riders grew clearer as they approached, forming out of the night with a quiet that felt heavier than noise, their silhouettes straight in the saddle, their movements synchronized without effort, as if each man understood the others without needing to look, and the absence of shouting, of chaos, of anything resembling disorder, unsettled the town more than any storm ever could. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward a few paces, boots pressing deeper into the dust, his hand resting near his belt not out of threat, but out of habit, his eyes narrowing as he tried to count, then stopped trying when the number passed what he could hold in his head. "Hold your ground," he said quietly, though no one had moved, his voice carrying less command than before, more reminder than authority, and the men behind him shifted slightly, not retreating, but not stepping forward either, caught in that narrow space between pride and uncertainty. The riders did not slow as they reached the outer edge of town, but they did not rush either, their pace unchanged, their formation holding, and as they came closer the details sharpened, the lines of their clothing, the markings worn with purpose, the way each man carried himself with a calm that did not need to prove anything to anyone standing in their path. There were many of them, far more than the first glance suggested, stretching beyond the immediate line of sight, their presence filling the open space without crowding it, like something vast that chose its shape carefully. Not one voice rose among them. Not one gesture broke the pattern. They moved as one, and when the lead riders reached a distance of about 50 yards from the town's edge, they stopped, not abruptly, not with a command shouted across the line, but with a natural stillness that passed through them all at once, as if the decision had been made long before they arrived. The silence that followed pressed in from every direction, thick and undeniable, and for a moment even the wind seemed to step back, leaving nothing between the two sides but open ground and the weight of what had not yet been spoken. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended, and took another step forward, forcing his posture into something steady, something that resembled the authority he had carried so easily only hours before. "You have business here," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance, firm enough to be heard, but lacking the certainty that had once made men follow without question, and the words hung in the air, unanswered, not ignored, but unreturned in a way that made them feel smaller than they were. Among the riders, a single figure shifted, not breaking formation, but stepping slightly ahead of the line, and even from where they stood, the townsmen could feel the change, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before something important is revealed. Back on the rise beyond the town, Elias Crow remained where he had been, unmoving, his gaze steady on the gathering below, the leather band still held in his hand, and beside him Nayeli watched in silence, her expression calm, her posture unshaken, as if what was unfolding was not a surprise, but a continuation of something that had begun long before any of them had spoken a word. "They have come," she said quietly, not to announce it, not to explain it, but simply to mark the moment for what it was, and Elias did not respond, because there was nothing left to say, not now, not when the truth was no longer something hidden in silence, but something riding steadily into the light. The man who stepped forward from the line of riders did not raise his voice, did not lift a hand, did not signal the others in any visible way. And yet the moment he moved, every eye in Red Hollow fixed on him, as if the entire night had been waiting for that single step to happen. He rode a few yards ahead, stopping well short of the town, leaving a clear space between himself and Sheriff Dalton Briggs, a space that felt deliberate, measured, like a boundary drawn without words, and for a long second, he simply sat there, posture straight, gaze steady, letting the silence settle where it needed to settle before anything else could begin. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat again, slower this time, as though he understood that whatever he said next would not carry the same weight it once did, and he adjusted his stance, boots firm in the dust, shoulders squared against the growing tension that pressed in from all sides. "You have not answered," he called out, the words careful, chosen, no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but edged with something that might have been caution. "State your business in this town." The rider did not respond immediately, and the delay stretched just long enough to make the question feel smaller than it had sounded. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the distance with a calm that did not need to be loud to be heard. "We are not here for your town," he said, each word clear, measured, as if placed exactly where it belonged. A faint ripple passed through the men standing behind Briggs, not movement, not retreat, but a subtle shift of understanding that did not yet have a shape. "Then you have ridden a long way for nothing," Briggs replied, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping from beneath him, but the rider did not take the bait, did not rise to the tone, did not alter the pace of what was unfolding. "We are here," the man continued, "for one who walked among you." The words settled heavier than anything spoken that night, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, the townsmen looked at one another instead of at the figures before them, searching faces, searching memory, searching for something they had dismissed too easily just hours before. Briggs did not turn, did not acknowledge the shift behind him, but his jaw tightened, and the hand near his belt lowered slightly, no longer resting where it had out of habit. "You are speaking of a drifter," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned, stretched too far to hold its shape. "A man who said nothing, did nothing, and left." The rider tilted his head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of something incomplete. "He spoke," the man said quietly. "You did not hear him." The words moved through the air like a slow wind, touching each man differently, and somewhere behind the front line, one of the younger townsmen shifted his weight, eyes dropping briefly to the ground, as if something he had laughed at earlier now carried a different meaning. The rider reached into his own coat, mirroring a gesture that none of them had thought important at the time, and brought out a piece of worn leather, holding it up just enough for the markings to catch the faint light spilling from the town behind them. A few of the older men inhaled sharply, not loudly, but enough to be noticed, their eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across faces that had seen more of the world than they often spoke about. Sheriff Briggs did not move, but his gaze fixed on the object, his expression tightening in a way that revealed he understood more than he wished to admit. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and for the first time, the question came not as a command, but as something closer to uncertainty. The rider's answer came without hesitation. "It was returned to us," he said, "carried by the man you mocked." Silence followed, deeper now, heavier, pressing against every man standing there, and no one laughed, no one spoke, because the shape of the night had changed in a way that could not be undone. Back on the rise beyond the town, Elias Crow stood. as he had before, unmoving, watching not the men, not the sheriff, but the space between them, the place where truth had begun to take form without force, without anger, without anything that could be fought or dismissed. And beside him Nayeli remained still, her gaze steady, her expression calm, as though what was happening was not a confrontation, but a correction, something long overdue, finding its way into the open. "They begin to see," she said quietly, and Elias did not answer. But the way his hand loosened slightly around the leather band spoke of something shifting, not in the town, not in the men who stood uncertain in the dust, but in the space between what had been believed and what was now becoming impossible to ignore. The words did not echo, yet they lingered, settling into the dust and the bones of every man standing there. And for a long moment no one moved, not because they were told to hold their ground, but because something deeper had taken hold, something that made movement feel like the wrong answer to a question none of them had asked out loud. Sheriff Dalton Briggs shifted his weight, slow and deliberate, his eyes still locked on the leather band in the rider's hand, as if the markings etched into it carried more authority than his badge ever had. And when he finally spoke, his voice came quieter, stripped of the sharp edges that once defined it. "You expect us to believe that man matters to you," he said, though the question did not land as a challenge, more like an attempt to steady something that had begun to tilt beyond his control. The rider did not react to the tone, did not rise to defend or argue, but instead lowered the leather band slightly, holding it closer to his chest, not as a possession, but as something carried with purpose. "He does not matter to us because he is strong," the man said, his voice even, unhurried, each word placed with care. "He matters because he did not turn away." A murmur passed through the townsmen, softer than before, less certain, and somewhere near the back, the older rancher who had spoken earlier nodded once, almost to himself, as if something he had felt but could not explain was now beginning to take shape. Briggs exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting, for the first time away from the rider, scanning the faces behind him, seeing not the confidence he expected, but something fractured, something searching. "You ride into a town in the middle of the night," he said, turning back, trying to reclaim ground that had already begun to slip. "You speak in riddles about a man who would not even answer a simple question, and you expect us to understand what you are saying." The rider's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, not forward, not back, but grounded, as if what came next did not require movement to carry weight. "You already understand," he replied quietly. "You just do not wish to accept it." The statement landed without force, yet it pressed harder than any raised voice could have, and the silence that followed stretched longer than before, filled not with uncertainty now, but with recognition that no one wanted to be the first to speak. Behind Briggs, one of the younger men swallowed hard, his eyes flicking briefly toward the saloon, toward the place where laughter had filled the air only hours ago, and then back to the rider, as if trying to reconcile the two moments into something that made sense. He never said a word. The young man muttered, not to challenge, not to argue, but to hold on to something that felt safer than what was unfolding. The rider turned his gaze slightly, not directly at the man, but enough for the words to find their mark. "Not with his voice," he said, "but you heard him all the same." The young man's expression tightened, confusion giving way to something closer to unease, and he looked down, as if the ground might offer an answer the air would not. Sheriff Briggs straightened, his shoulders lifting just enough to suggest he was still in control, though the gesture felt thinner now, stretched over something that no longer supported it. "If he is so important," Briggs said, forcing the words into a steadier shape, "then where is he?" The question hung there, simple, direct, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, the man at their front did not answer immediately, did not fill the space with explanation, but instead turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting past the town, past the gathered men, toward the low rise beyond where the land met the night. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but it carried with it a weight that drew every eye in the same direction, and for a moment the entire town seemed to pivot, attention pulled toward a place they had not thought to look. On that rise, barely outlined against the fading dark, stood a figure unmoving, still as the land itself, and beside him another, equally quiet, equally certain, and though the distance blurred the details, There was no mistaking the presence that settled over that space. The same presence that had filled the saloon without a word, that had walked through their laughter without reacting, that had left without needing to explain anything at all. "He is where he has always been," the rider said softly, his voice carrying across the distance without effort. "Standing." The words settled into the night, simple, unadorned, yet heavier than anything spoken before it, and one by one, the men of Red Hollow began to understand that the silence they had mocked was never empty, never weak, but something far more difficult to face, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard, something that had now returned, not in anger, not in force, but in a way that left no room for doubt, no space to hide behind laughter or dismissal, only the quiet, steady weight of truth. No one spoke when the figure on the rise became clear, not fully, not in detail, but enough for recognition to settle into the space between them. And it was not the kind of recognition that comes from familiarity, but the kind that comes from realizing you were wrong about something that had been right in front of you all along. Elias Crow did not move, did not step forward, did not raise a hand to claim the attention now fixed on him. And yet every man in Red Hollow felt the shift, felt the weight of his presence now that it was no longer surrounded by laughter, no longer framed by misunderstanding, but standing alone against the open land with nothing to hide behind and nothing to prove. Sheriff Dalton Briggs narrowed his eyes, studying the silhouette as though distance might change what he was seeing, as though the man who had sat in his saloon hours ago could somehow be different from the one standing there now. But the stillness was the same, the posture unchanged, the silence just as complete, only now it carried something else with it, something the sheriff could not dismiss as easily as before. "That is him," one of the men behind Briggs said quietly, not as a question, not as a statement that needed confirmation, but as something spoken because it had to be said out loud to be believed, and the words settled into the group like a truth they had all reached at the same time. The rider at the front of the line did not turn back, did not look to Elias for instruction, but remained facing the town, as if the connection between them did not require acknowledgement, as if it had already been established long before any of this began. "You mocked him," the rider said, his voice carrying across the space with the same calm weight as before, and this time there was no mistaking the direction of the words, no ambiguity left to soften their meaning. Sheriff Briggs took a slow breath, his chest rising just enough to show that whatever control he believed he held was being tested in ways he had not prepared for. "He gave us nothing," Briggs replied, though the words sounded thinner now, less certain, as if they no longer fit the moment the way they once had. "A man who says nothing earns nothing." The rider's gaze remained steady, unshaken by the attempt to reclaim ground. "He gave you the chance to see him," the man said. "You chose not to." The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not filled with tension now, but with something heavier, something that pressed inward rather than outward, forcing each man to face the space between what he had done and what he now understood. One of the older ranchers stepped forward slightly, not enough to break from the group, but enough to be seen, his eyes fixed on Elias in the distance, his expression thoughtful, measured. "What did he do?" the rancher asked, his voice steady, carrying none of the earlier mockery, only a quiet need to understand what had shifted so completely in such a short span of time. The rider did not answer immediately, and when he did, his words came slower, as if each one carried weight that could not be rushed. "There was a winter," he began, and the way he said it made the air feel colder, made the ground seem harder beneath their boots. "A winter when the river froze early and the snow came heavy, deeper than a man's knee, and children were lost between the trees where the paths disappear. No one interrupted. No one shifted. Even the wind seemed to pull back, leaving the words to settle without disturbance. He found them," the rider continued. "Not one, not two. He found them all." A faint breath moved through the townsmen, not quite a sound, but enough to mark the moment. "He carried those who could not walk," the rider said. "He stayed when the night fell and the cold took hold. He did not ask who they belonged to. He did not ask what they would give him in return." The rancher's gaze dropped briefly, then lifted again, sharper now, as if something inside him had aligned with what he was hearing. "And you call him brother," the rancher said, not questioning, but acknowledging something that had already become clear. The rider inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in confirmation of something that did not need to be explained further. "We call him what he has already proven himself to be," he said. Behind them, on the rise, Elias Crow remained as he had been, silent, still, his figure unchanged, and yet the space around him felt different now, no longer empty, no longer dismissed, but filled with something that could not be ignored, something that had traveled across miles of land without force, without demand, and had arrived here not to confront, but to reveal. Nayeli stood beside him, her eyes on the town, her expression calm, as if she had known this moment would come from the very beginning. "They understand now," she said quietly, and Elias did not answer, because understanding, like silence, did not always need to be spoken to be real. The story did not end when the rider finished speaking. It only deepened, settling into the silence that followed like something heavy finding its place. And for the first time since the night began, no one in Red Hollow looked to Sheriff Dalton Briggs for direction. No one waited for him to speak, because the weight of what had been revealed did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to all of them. The older rancher took another small step forward, his boots pressing into the dust with a quiet certainty that had been missing before, his eyes still fixed on Elias in the distance, not with doubt now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to respect that had arrived too late to feel comfortable. "Why did he not say it?" the rancher asked, his voice low, steady, carrying the question that had begun to form in more than one mind. Why sit there and take it if he had nothing to prove? The rider at the front of the line did not hesitate this time, as though the answer had always been ready, waiting for someone willing to ask the right question. "Because he does not carry his worth in his voice," the man said. "He carries it in what he has already done." The words settled deeper than the ones before, not sharp, not forceful, but undeniable, and behind the rancher, one of the younger men lowered his gaze, the memory of his own laughter no longer something distant, but something immediate, something he could not step away from no matter how still he stood. Sheriff Briggs remained where he was, though the posture that once defined him had begun to loosen, the certainty in his stance replaced by something quieter, something less certain, and when he finally spoke, it was not to challenge, not to dismiss, but to hold on to what little ground he believed remained. "A man who keeps silent invites judgment," he said, though the words felt weaker than he intended, stretched thin by the truth that had already filled the space around them. The rider's gaze did not shift, did not waver, and when he answered, it came with the same calm weight that had carried every word since the riders arrived. "No," he said quietly. "A man who keeps silent reveals who is willing to judge without knowing." The sentence landed like a mirror held up to the town, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue against, nothing left to dismiss, only the reflection of what they had done, clear and unbroken. The wind moved lightly across the open ground, lifting small trails of dust between the two sides, and somewhere in the distance a horse shifted, the soft sound echoing faintly in the stillness. But no one turned, no one looked away, because the moment had taken hold in a way that demanded attention. Then, without command, without signal, something changed among the riders, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a shift in posture, a movement of hands, and then one by one, beginning with the man at the front, they dismounted, boots touching the ground in unison, not with force, not with urgency, but with intention, each movement controlled, measured, deliberate. The sound of it carried softly across the distance, not loud, but unmistakable, and the men of Red Hollow watched without speaking, without understanding at first what they were seeing, only feeling that whatever was happening did not belong to threat, did not belong to confrontation, but to something else entirely. The rider stepped forward on foot now, closing the distance by a few yards, still leaving space between himself and the town, and then he stopped again, placing one hand briefly over his chest, not as a gesture of authority, not as a signal of power, but as something older, something that carried meaning beyond words. Behind him, the others followed, each man mirroring the motion, hands to their chests, heads lowering slightly, not in submission, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before it, filled not with tension now, but with something steady, something certain. The older rancher's breath caught slightly, the realization settling in before the words could form, and he glanced toward Briggs, not for instruction, not for approval, but because the moment demanded witness, and the sheriff, for the first time since the night began, did not speak, did not move, did not attempt to reclaim what had already passed beyond him. On the rise beyond the town, Elias Crow remained where he stood, watching, his posture unchanged, his silence intact, and yet the space around him had shifted completely, no longer defined by absence, but by presence, by something that had been carried across miles without being announced, without being defended, and had now arrived in full view of those who had failed to see it when it sat right in front of them. Nayeli stood beside him, her expression calm, her gaze steady, and though she said nothing this time, the quiet certainty in her presence echoed the gesture unfolding. Below, a recognition that needed no explanation, no translation, only the willingness to see it for what it was. And in that moment, as the riders stood in silent acknowledgement, as the town stood in quiet realization, the distance between them was no longer measured in yards or steps, but in something far more difficult to cross, something that could not be forced, could not be demanded, only understood, and only accepted by those willing to face what they had once chosen to ignore. No one told them to kneel, and yet the feeling of it spread through the town like a quiet understanding that had arrived too late to be stopped, too heavy to ignore, and though the men of Red Hollow did not drop to the ground, something in them lowered all the same, something that had stood tall only hours before now settling under the weight of what they had seen and what they had failed to see when it mattered. The older rancher was the first to remove his hat, not as a gesture meant to be noticed, not as something done for display, but as something instinctive, something that came from a place deeper than pride, and the simple motion carried farther than any shout ever could, because one by one, others followed, slow at first, then with quiet certainty, hats coming off, eyes lowering, the sound of shifting boots replacing the noise that had once filled the same ground. Sheriff Dalton Briggs did not move right away, his posture still holding the last fragments of authority he had worn like armor for years. But even that began to crack under the silence, under the absence of anything he could command or control, and when he finally reached up, removing his hat with a motion that felt unfamiliar, it was not for the riders, not for the town, but because there was nothing left to hide behind. The rider at the front watched this without expression, without approval, without acknowledgement, because what mattered was not the gesture itself, but the understanding behind it, and that understanding could not be forced, could not be demanded, only arrived at by those willing to see what had been placed before them. "You see him now," the rider said quietly, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement that carried the weight of everything that had unfolded, and no one answered, because the answer was already there, written in the way they stood, in the way they avoided looking directly at the rise where Elias remained, as if the distance between them had become something harder to cross than any physical ground. The younger man who had spoken earlier took a hesitant step forward, not enough to break from the group entirely, but enough to mark the shift within him, his voice unsteady as he spoke, not to the rider, not to the sheriff, but to the space itself. "We did not know," he said, the words sounding smaller than he expected, thinner, as if they could not carry the weight he was trying to place on them. The rider's gaze moved toward him, not harsh, not forgiving, simply present. "No," the man said. "You chose not to know." The correction came without anger, without accusation, but it settled deeper than any raised voice could have, and the young man's shoulders dropped slightly, the truth finding its place where excuses had tried to stand. A long silence followed, not empty, not uncertain, but full, filled with the quiet work of understanding, of recognition, of something shifting in ways that could not be undone. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the older rancher turned his body, not toward the riders, not toward the sheriff, but toward the rise where Elias stood, and though the distance remained, the intention was clear, and after a moment, others followed, one by one, their attention moving away from where they had expected conflict, toward where something far more difficult to face had been waiting all along. Sheriff Briggs hesitated, the last to turn, the last to let go of the position he had held for so long. But even he could not remain where he was. Not when the entire weight of the moment had shifted beyond him, and with a slow breath, he turned as well, his gaze lifting toward the rise, toward the man he had dismissed without a second thought. Elias Crow did not move, did not step forward, did not acknowledge the shift below him. And yet the stillness he held now carried a different meaning, no longer something that invited judgment, but something that demanded reflection, something that asked nothing and revealed everything. Naeli stood beside him, her presence steady, her expression calm, and, though she said nothing, there was a quiet certainty in the way she watched the town, as if she understood that what was happening below was not about the riders, not about the numbers, not about the power they could have brought if they chose to, but about something far more enduring, something that could only take root in silence, in recognition, in the space between what had been done and what could still be changed. The rider at the front lowered his hand from his chest, not as a signal, not as an end, but as a continuation of something already understood, and behind him, the others remained as they were, still, grounded, their presence no longer something that threatened, but something that affirmed, something that stood not against the town, but beside the truth that had finally found its place within it. And in that quiet, in that space where no one raised a voice, where no one reached for anything but their own understanding, Red Hollow began, slowly, to change. The silence did not break, it shifted, changing shape in a way that could be felt more than heard. And in that shift something began to move within the men of Red Hollow, not outward, not toward the riders, but inward, toward the place where pride had once stood unquestioned. The older rancher took another step forward, this time not stopping at the edge of intention, but carrying it into action, his boots crossing the invisible line that had separated the town from the truth, now standing before them. And though no one told him to move, though no one followed immediately, the weight of his choice settled into the ground like a marker that could not be ignored. He walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured not in distance, but in meaning, his eyes fixed not on the riders, not on Sheriff Dalton Briggs, but on the rise where Elias Crow stood, still as ever, unchanged, and yet somehow entirely different in the way he was now seen. The rider at the front did not stop him, did not acknowledge him, because the moment did not belong to interference, it belonged to understanding, and understanding, once begun, does not need permission to continue. Behind the rancher, one of the younger men hesitated, then followed, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by something quieter, something more certain, and soon. Others began to move as well, not all at once, not in unison, but one by one, each man stepping forward in his own time, carrying with him the weight of what he had said, what he had laughed at, what he now wished he had seen differently. Sheriff Briggs remained where he was, watching as the town shifted without him, the authority he once held slipping not through defiance, but through something far more difficult to control, something that did not rise against him, but simply moved past him, leaving him standing where he had always been, only now without the certainty that had once defined him. He looked toward the riders, then toward the men walking forward, and finally toward the rise, where Elias stood, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no attempt to measure or control, only a quiet recognition that what was happening no longer belonged to him. On the rise, Naeli glanced at Elias, her expression steady, her voice soft when she spoke. "They come to you now," she said, not as a statement of victory, not as something to be claimed, but as a simple observation of what had changed. Elias did not move, did not step forward to meet them, did not lift his head in acknowledgement, and yet his stillness held its ground, not as distance, not as refusal, but as something that allowed the others to cross what needed to be crossed on their own. The rancher was the first to reach the base of the rise, stopping a few yards short, removing his hat again though he had never put it back on, holding it at his side as if unsure what else to do with his hands. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze lifting to meet Elias's, the silence between them stretching not with tension, but with something that resembled respect. "We were wrong," the rancher said finally, the words simple, unadorned, carrying no defense, no excuse, only the weight of acceptance, and though his voice was not loud, it carried clearly enough for the others to hear, for the town to feel, for the moment to settle fully into place. Elias looked at him, not long, not searching, just enough to acknowledge the words without claiming them, and then his gaze shifted slightly, not to dismiss, not to avoid, but to include the others now gathering behind the rancher, each man standing with his own version of the same realization, each one holding something unspoken that did not need to be voiced to be understood. The younger man stepped forward next, his hands empty, his shoulders no longer tight, his voice quieter than before. "We should have listened," he said, though he knew now that listening had never required words, only attention, something he had not given when it mattered. Elias did not answer, but the absence of response did not feel like rejection. It felt like space, space for the words to exist without needing to be answered, space for the understanding to settle without being confirmed. Behind them, Sheriff Briggs finally moved, not with authority, not with command, but with something closer to humility, stepping forward at a slower pace, his eyes fixed on Elias as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and when he reached the others, he stopped, not stepping ahead, not placing himself above them, but standing among them, equal in the moment, equal in what had been misunderstood. "I judged a man without knowing him," Briggs said, the admission coming harder than the others, but landing with the same weight, and for a moment, that was all that needed to be said. The riders remained where they were, still, silent, their presence unchanged, not pressing forward, not demanding anything more, because what had come to pass did not require force, did not require completion. It had already done what it was meant to do. On the rise, Elias Crow stood as he always had, silent, steady, the leather band resting once more in his hand, and in that moment, without a word, without a gesture, he accepted what had been offered, not as something owed, not as something earned, but as something that had finally been seen for what it was, something that had never needed to be spoken to be real. The moment did not end with the words spoken at the base of the rise. It deepened, settling into something quieter, something more lasting, like the last light of day that does not disappear all at once, but lingers just long enough for a man to see clearly what stands before him. And for the first time since the riders arrived, there was no division between the town and the open land beyond it, no line that separated one from the other, only a shared stillness that held everything in place. Elias Crow shifted his weight slightly, not a step, not a retreat, just enough to mark that he had heard, that he had understood, and the small movement carried more meaning than any speech could have, because it acknowledged what had been offered without claiming it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. The older rancher lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in shame now, but in reflection, then lifted it again, steadier, clearer, as if something within him had been set right, not erased, not forgotten, but understood in a way that would not allow it to be repeated. Behind him, the others stood in quiet agreement, not speaking, not needing to, because the words had already been said, and repeating them would not make them truer than they already were. Sheriff Dalton Briggs remained among them, no longer apart, no longer above, his posture no longer defined by authority but by presence, and for a man who had built his life on being the one others looked to, the shift was not small, not easy, but it was real, and in that reality there was something that resembled strength, not the kind that commands, but the kind that accepts. He looked once more toward Elias, holding the gaze a second longer this time, not searching for weakness, not measuring, but recognizing, and then he lowered his eyes slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that would have been unthinkable only hours before. The rider at the front of the line watched this unfold without interruption, his expression unchanged, because what mattered was not the apology, not the admission, but the transformation that had taken place beneath them, something that could not be forced, something that could only arrive when the truth had been seen clearly enough to leave no room for anything else. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his head toward Elias, and though the distance between them remained, the connection was unmistakable, silent, steady, complete. He placed his hand over his chest once more, this time not as a signal to the others, but as something more personal, something directed, and after a brief pause, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried with it respect, recognition, and something deeper than either. Behind him, the others mirrored the motion, not in perfect unison, not as a display, but as a shared understanding, each man acknowledging in his own time, in his own way, the bond that had been formed long before this night, long before this town, long before any of them had stood in judgment of something they did not understand. The word was not spoken, but it did not need to be, because it moved through the air all the same, carried in the stillness, in the gesture, in the way every man present felt it settle into place. Brother, not as a title, not as a claim, but as a truth that had already been earned. On the rise, Naeli watched this with quiet certainty, her eyes moving from the riders to the men below, then back to Elias. And for a moment there was something like a faint smile at the edge of her expression, not of triumph, not of satisfaction, but of recognition that what needed to happen had happened, and nothing more was required. Elias did not return the gesture in the same way, did not place his hand over his chest, did not bow his head, but there was a subtle change in the way he stood, a slight easing in the tension that had never been visible until it was no longer there. And in that small shift, he answered without speaking, accepted without claiming, stood without needing to prove anything further. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying away the last remnants of what had filled the town earlier that evening. The laughter, the judgment, the certainty that had once seemed so firm, leaving behind something quieter, something steadier, something that would remain long after the night had passed. One by one, the riders began to step back, not turning away abruptly, not breaking the moment, but easing out of it with the same control they had entered with, their movements deliberate, respectful, as if they understood that what had been set in place did not need their continued presence to hold. The man at the front was the last to move, holding his position for a moment longer, his gaze resting on Elias, then shifting briefly to the town, taking in what had changed, what had been learned, and then he turned, mounting his horse with a quiet ease, his posture unchanged, his purpose fulfilled. The others followed, forming once more into the line that had arrived out of the darkness, and without a word, without a signal, they began to ride, their pace steady, their direction clear, carrying with them nothing taken, nothing demanded, leaving behind only the truth they had brought with them, and the understanding that had finally found its place in Red Hollow. The riders did not disappear all at once. They faded into the horizon the same way they had arrived, steady, controlled, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy, no longer pressed against the town like something waiting to break, but instead settled gently, like dust returning to the earth after a long ride. And for a long moment no one in Red Hollow moved, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that movement, like words, needed to carry meaning now. The older rancher was the first to shift, turning slightly, not away from the rise, but toward the others, his expression calmer than before, not relieved, not burdened, but balanced in a way that comes when a man has seen something clearly enough to change him. He placed his hat back on his head slowly, not as a return to who he had been, but as a continuation of who he had become in that moment. And the simple gesture seemed to release something in the others, a quiet permission to move forward without losing what they had just learned. One by one, the men began to turn back toward the town, their steps slower than usual, their voices absent, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in silence. Sheriff Dalton Briggs lingered a moment longer, his gaze still resting on Elias Crow, and though the distance between them remained, something in that space had changed permanently, something that could not be undone by time or distance or the return of routine. He nodded once, small, almost unnoticeable, not as a command, not as an acknowledgement meant to be seen, but as something personal, something that belonged only to him. And then he turned as well, stepping back toward the town he had once controlled so easily, now carrying a weight that would not leave him the same. The younger man hesitated before following, his eyes lifting once more to the rise, as if trying to hold on to the image, not of the riders, not of the moment, but of Elias standing there, silent, unchanged, and for the first time, the silence no longer confused him, no longer felt like absence, but like something full, something that required nothing from anyone else to be real. On the rise, Elias Crow remained where he had always been, his posture steady, his gaze resting on the town not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a quiet acceptance that asked nothing more than what had already been given. Naeli stood beside him, her presence as calm as the land itself, and after a moment, she turned slightly, her eyes moving from the town to the open horizon where the riders had disappeared, and then back to Elias. "It is done," she said softly, not as an ending, but as a recognition that what needed to happen had already taken place. Elias did not respond, but his hand closed gently around the leather band, the worn edges pressing into his palm in a way that grounded him, not in the past, not in the moment, but in something that connected both without needing to be explained. The town behind them began to settle into its familiar shapes, doors closing, lamps dimming, the sounds of ordinary life returning slowly, carefully, as if aware that something within it had shifted and needed time to find its new place. No one laughed the way they had before. No voice carried that same careless edge. Even the smallest sounds seemed measured now, held to a standard that had not existed just hours earlier. The older rancher paused near the edge of the street, looking back once more toward the rise, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and though he said nothing, there was something in the way he stood that suggested the lesson would not be forgotten, not by him, not by those who had stood beside him, not by the town itself. Sheriff Briggs entered the saloon last, the door closing behind him with a softer sound than before, and for a moment he stood just inside, looking at the empty tables, the glasses left where they had been set down, the space that had once felt like his domain now carrying a different weight, a different meaning, and he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in understanding. Outside, the night stretched on, calm, steady, unchanged in its appearance but altered in its meaning, and on the rise beyond the town, Elias Crow finally turned, not away from something, not towards something, but simply continuing, his steps quiet, his path his own, and Nayeli moved beside him, neither leading nor following, just present, as the two figures walked into the open land where no words were needed, where no explanations were required, where what had been proven did not need to be repeated, only carried forward in the same silence that had revealed it in the first place. Morning came slow over Red Hollow, not with the sharp brightness that usually chased the night away, but with a softer light that seemed to settle gently across the rooftops, the fences, the dust that still held the memory of what had happened. And for those who stepped outside early, there was a quiet in the air that felt different from any morning before it, not empty, not still, but aware. The town moved, but it moved carefully, as if each step, each word, each glance carried more weight than it had the day before. The saloon doors opened without the usual force, the hinges creaking in a way that sounded louder now that no laughter rushed to fill the space behind them, and inside, the men who gathered did not take their seats with the same careless ease, did not throw their voices across the room as if nothing had changed, because something had, and they all knew it. Sheriff Dalton Briggs stood behind the bar for a moment before anyone else spoke, his hands resting lightly on the wood, his gaze moving across the room not to command, not to measure, but to observe, and when he finally stepped forward, it was without the weight of authority he once carried so easily, replaced now by something quieter, something steadier. The older rancher sat near the window, hat low, eyes turned toward the rise beyond town, though the figures from the night before were gone, and when a younger man approached, hesitating slightly before taking the seat across from him, there was no need for explanation, no need for words to bridge what had already been understood. "You see him different now," the younger man said, his voice low, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something that needed to remain settled. The rancher nodded once, slow, deliberate. "No," he replied. "I see myself different." The words lingered between them, simple, unadorned, and they carried farther than anything spoken the night before, because they did not point outward, did not place weight on another man's shoulders, but turned inward, where change begins and either takes hold or fades away. Outside, a boy no older than 10 stood near the hitching post, staring toward the open land, his small hand tracing patterns in the dust with the tip of his boot, and beside him, his mother watched quietly, not calling him back, not rushing him inside, because even she could feel that something had shifted in the way the town held itself, something that allowed space for reflection where there had once only been noise. Was he a hero? The boy asked after a moment, his voice carrying that simple curiosity that had not yet learned to hide behind pride or assumption, and his mother glanced toward the horizon, then back at him, her expression thoughtful. "No," she said softly. "He was a man who did what needed to be done." The boy nodded, as if the answer made sense in a way that did not require anything more, and he looked back out toward the land, his small figure still against the wide stretch of morning light. Far beyond the town, where the land opened into rolling stretches of dry grass and distant hills, two figures moved along a narrow path, their pace steady, unhurried, their direction clear without needing to be spoken. Elias Crow walked as he always had, his steps quiet, his posture unchanged, the leather band resting once more in his hand, its worn edges catching the light in brief flashes that came and went with each movement. Nayeli walked beside him, her presence as constant as the horizon itself, and for a long while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. The wind moved across the open land, carrying with it the faintest traces of the town behind them, the sound of a door closing, the distant call of a voice, the small, ordinary rhythms of life returning to a place that would never quite be the same again. After some time, Nayeli glanced toward Elias, her expression calm, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "They will remember," she said, not as a question, not as a hope, but as a simple recognition of what had been set in motion. Elias did not answer, but his hand tightened slightly around the leather band, not in possession, not in defense, but in acknowledgement, and after a moment, he lifted his gaze toward the horizon, toward the path ahead, where the land stretched wide and open, unchanged by what had passed, yet somehow carrying it all the same. Behind them, Red Hollow settled into its new shape, not marked by what had arrived in the night, but by what had been left behind, a quieter understanding, a steadier sense of what mattered, and a silence that no longer invited judgment, but demanded respect. And out there, beyond the reach of voices and walls, Elias Crow continued on, not as a man who had proven something, not as a man who had claimed anything, but simply as a man who had stood, and in standing, had shown a town the difference between being seen and being understood, a difference that, once learned, does not fade, does not break, but remains, quiet and certain, like the land itself.